Do you think silence in a family says more than shouting?
When I stepped up to the podium, the lights were bright enough that I couldn't really see the audience, but I knew exactly what I would find if I squinted hard enough. Rows of strangers, colleagues, even a few acquaintances I barely knew. And not a single familiar face that shared my last name or my bloodline, because once again my family had decided that what mattered to me wasn't worth their time, and for the first few moments it burned like acid in my throat, but then a kind of calm washed over me, the kind that only comes when disappointment is so expected it turns into routine. I had told myself in the weeks leading up to this event that maybe, just maybe, they would surprise me, that perhaps this time they would show up and clap, or at least send a simple text saying, "We're proud of you." But as I glanced at the rows of empty chairs where they should have been, I felt something inside me click, like a door closing that should have been locked years ago. So when it was my turn to speak, and I gripped the microphone with a steadiness that startled even me, I made a decision in real time. A decision that didn't come from rehearsed words or polite gratitude, but from years of swallowing back my voice. And I looked into the nearest camera lens and said, clear enough that the sound technician tilted his head in surprise, to the ones who were too busy to care, "Stay that way." The room went dead silent for a second, and then the audience erupted in confused applause, not sure if I was being poetic or dramatic or simply raw, but I didn't care how they interpreted it, because those words weren't meant for them. They were meant for the people sitting comfortably at home, the people who had excused themselves for decades with lines like, "We didn't want to embarrass you by showing up," or, "We're just not into those kinds of events," when in reality they simply couldn't be bothered. The rest of my talk passed in a blur, my voice steady, my message clear, but my mind already racing toward what I had just done, because for the first time in my life I hadn't tried to soften the blow for them. I hadn't covered up their absence with polite excuses. I had said the truth out loud in front of hundreds of strangers, and as much as I worried I might regret it, there was also a thrill in knowing I had finally drawn a line in the sand. When the applause finally died down and the event wrapped, I returned to my hotel room expecting maybe a few polite messages from colleagues, some obligatory congratulations, but what happened next left me frozen with my phone buzzing so fast it overheated. My inbox exploded. Dozens, then hundreds of emails and messages, some from people I barely remembered, others from industry leaders I had once thought were untouchable, and each one carried some version of the same theme. Thank you for saying what so many of us have felt. Strangers poured their own stories into my messages, describing absent fathers, dismissive mothers, siblings who pretended not to notice when milestones were skipped, and it hit me that by speaking one line of truth into that microphone, I had tapped into something far larger than my own hurt. Yet beneath the flood of validation and connection, there was a pit in my stomach, because I knew it was only a matter of time before the people those words were really meant for saw them, and when they did, the storm would be personal, not polite. And I didn't have to wait long. As I scrolled through message after message, my eyes caught on one subject line that made my heart stutter. "We need to talk." It was from my mother. The timestamp showed it had been sent less than an hour after my talk ended, which meant she must have either been watching the live stream or someone had sent her the clip before I even stepped off the stage. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen, torn between the rush of power I felt from finally speaking my truth and the dread of what was about to come, because I knew my family, and I knew they would never admit to what they had done. Never acknowledge the years of absence and dismissal. They would twist it, they would make me the villain, and in that moment, standing there in the half-lit room with my phone buzzing relentlessly, I realized that what had begun as one off-the-cuff line spoken into a microphone had set off a chain reaction that I might never be able to undo. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, staring at my mother's name, and the only question running through my head was not whether I should respond, but how far I was willing to go now that the line had been crossed. Because if she thought this was going to end with an apology, she didn't know me nearly as well as she liked to believe. I stared at my mother's subject line for long enough that the words started to blur, and while a reasonable person might have waited until the next day or drafted something careful that walked the line between honesty and diplomacy, I knew from too many late-night arguments and too many mornings that began with apologies I did not owe that if I gave her even a little time she would turn this into a lecture about respect and tone and family loyalty, so I pressed call and listened to the rings. Stack up like little warnings I ignored on purpose, and when her voice came through, clipped and already loaded, she did not ask how the event went or whether I was safe or proud or exhausted. She opened with a sharp, "What was that?" followed by the kind of sigh she uses to tell me I have humiliated her without ever using the word, which is funny given that she never turns up for the things that could actually embarrass or honor her, but she always finds a way to claim the fallout. I let her talk, because I have learned that interrupting only gives her new angles to explore, and as she ran through her list of grievances, why did I attack the family on a public stage? Why did I try to make them look like villains? Why couldn't I handle things privately like an adult? I realized that none of what she said had anything to do with what happened today or this year or even the last decade, because underneath the scolding was the same message I have heard since I was old enough to make a decision they did not pre-approve, which is that my feelings are inconvenient and my milestones are negotiable, and that the family brand is the only thing that matters, and if that means pretending not to notice when they forget, then I am supposed to pretend along with them. When she finally paused long enough to inhale, I said, as calmly as I could manage, that what I said on stage was not about image, it was about reality. And if she wanted to talk about humiliation, then we could start with the graduation they skipped without warning, and the lease signing where I needed an extra set of hands, and ended up bribing a neighbor with takeout to carry the heavy boxes, and the surgery recovery where I sat upright and waited through the afternoon because she promised to call and never did, and the holiday dinner that turned into a group photo from which I was missing like a placeholder no one remembered to fill, and I told her I did not keep score then, because I assumed at some point someone would notice and offer to make it right. But since that day never came, I had simply chosen to stop pretending that everything was fine. She bristled. Of course she did, and after a beat that sounded suspiciously like a cue, my sister's voice slid onto the line with that theatrical blend of concern and disdain she saves for when she thinks an audience is listening. And she told me that I had taken things too far and that I was being dramatic and that I should delete whatever clip was going around before it did permanent damage to our relationships, and I asked her which relationship exactly she meant. The one where she sends me a smiling selfie every year on the day I present something big because she forgot the time again and wants to perform support from a safe distance, or the one where she forwards my invites to our brother with "Are you going to this?" and then never follows up. And before she could spin the answer into a sermon about forgiveness, my brother chimed in long enough to call me ungrateful, which is rich coming from a man who has never once paid for his own emergencies, but never misses a chance to call my work a hobby. I hung up before the conversation turned into the usual tangle of accusations and rescues and revised memories, and for a few minutes I just sat there with my phone in my lap, listening to the silence that follows a choice you cannot walk back. And I thought about how easy it would be to post another line or clap back at their comments and let the internet turn it into a spectacle, and then I decided I was done feeding them drama they could reframe and dismiss, because if they were going to feel anything close to what they have made me feel for years, it would not be through a public fight they could shrug off as a misunderstanding. It would be through a mirror held so close to their faces that they could not mistake the reflection for anyone else. So I opened my laptop and built a simple document that listed every milestone of mine they skipped and every excuse offered in the aftermath, written plainly and dated. Each entry paired with a screenshot or an email or a text message that required no commentary, and I titled it "What Support Looks Like When It Is Real," and I attached it to an email addressed to my parents and my siblings and, for the first time in my life, BCC'd the aunts and uncles and family friends who like to tell me in private that they are sorry I got the short end while praising the family out loud for being so tight, and in the body I wrote that I would not argue or explain or apologize, that I would simply let the record speak for itself, and that going forward contact with me would require behavior, not promises. Then, Because I am tired of bracing for the calls and the edits and the late-night guilt trips, I scheduled the message to land in their inboxes at a very normal morning hour when they like to forward motivational quotes and weekend brunch photos. And I closed the laptop and sat back and let myself breathe, and only after the scheduling confirmation flashed and disappeared did I notice a new notification from an unknown address with a station domain and a subject line that read like opportunity, disguised as a dare. Which is when I realized that while my family would wake to a mirror they could finally not ignore, the rest of the city might hear my voice much sooner than they expected. The station email looked clinical in the subject line and almost bored in the body, the kind of invitation that tries not to sound too eager in case the recipient is, and yet between the lines I could hear the hum of a door unlocking. Because they had seen the clip, the producer had watched it twice, a senior host had forwarded it with a short note that said this is the sentence everyone is choking on today, and they wanted me in the studio the very next afternoon to talk about why a grown woman would look into a camera and tell her own family to keep their distance, which would have sounded like a trap on any other week. But tonight it felt like a stage that for once was not borrowed or tolerated, but actually mine. I wrote back without waiting for permission from the part of me that still worries about making waves, and I said that I would come if they agreed to two conditions that were not dramatic but were non-negotiable. That we would do the conversation live to tape with minimal edits, and that I would not be forced to pretend everything was complicated when most of it was painfully simple, and the producer replied within minutes that those terms were not only fine but frankly refreshing, which made me laugh in a way that surprised me. Because it turns out being treated like an adult with a spine is a novelty when you are the family oddball whose success is allowed only if it is quiet. While the booking details pinged into my inbox, I opened a blank page and started mapping the hour like a strategist laying out positions on a board, not to dramatize, but to make sure the truth landed without getting hijacked. And I listed the 3 threads I would weave together without naming anyone outright, because this was never about public punishment. It was about reclaiming the ground I had been forced to surrender out of politeness. So I wrote down the pattern of absence that stretched across years, the chorus of excuses that always arrived late and out of breath, and the quiet choice I had made to stop chasing people who never turned toward me unless there was something to collect. I copied key receipts into a folder labeled with a calm, almost bland phrase that would not spook anyone if it ever appeared in a screenshot, and I added that document I had scheduled for the morning. The one that simply laid out dates and facts and messages without a single insult, because the point was never to injure, it was to stop bleeding. Before I shut the laptop for the night, I set up an auto-reply that sounded like a steady hand rather than a siren, thanking people for sharing their stories and giving them a simple form to say whether they would be comfortable letting me read a few lines anonymously on air, and as the responses trickled in faster than I could skim them, I realized that what had felt like a solitary ache was actually a crowded room, and that if I did this correctly I would not be dragging my family into a spectacle. I would be opening a door for 1,000 strangers who had swallowed the same kind of dismissal and needed to hear it called by its name. I slept a little, woke before the alarm, and watched the scheduled email fire off to my relatives and the BCC list, then turned my phone face down when the first reply buzzed, because whatever came in would tempt me to defend myself before I was on safe ground. And I was done defending. I was done offering explanations to people who loved the performance of closeness more than the practice of it. By late morning, the producer called to confirm the segment and asked gently whether I planned to go there, which made me smile because the answer had changed overnight. I said I would speak with clarity and without venom, and I would keep names out of it unless someone decided to gaslight me in real time, and then we would pivot to the receipts. And he exhaled like a man who had watched too many soft segments that tiptoed to nowhere, telling me that if I stuck to that promise the show would carry the full conversation, which sounded like an invitation to do something larger than vent. On the car ride over I rehearsed the first paragraph out loud, not the words, but the posture, a tone that says I am not here to destroy anyone, I am here to stop being erased. And I decided that the final minutes of the segment would not be a crescendo of outrage, but a piece of construction, because that is where the real revenge lies, not in humiliation but in building something undeniable. I walked into the lobby and the receptionist handed me a guest badge with my name printed correctly, a small miracle that felt like a private omen, and while I waited for the producer to walk me back, my phone vibrated with a message from a cousin who rarely texted except to send holiday photos, and what he sent was not a greeting, but a screenshot of a calendar invite titled Family Night that had been scheduled for the exact hour of my event, complete with a note in my mother's handwriting that said everyone except her, smile big, and there it was, the cleanest proof I could have asked for. Not a misunderstanding, not a last-minute conflict, but a deliberate choice wrapped in a joke, and I stared at it long enough to feel the heat rise and then drop. Because this was the lever I had needed, the one that would move the conversation from feelings to facts. I forwarded the screenshot into the bland folder and wrote one sentence I planned to read if anyone suggested I had exaggerated. A single line that said they were together while I was on stage, and they announced it like a punchline, and when the producer waved me toward the hallway and the on-air light flickered from dark to ready, I put the phone on silent, squared my shoulders, and decided that the last question of the segment would not be about them at all. It would be the announcement of a small, stubborn fund named for the sentence I spoke into the camera, a promise to cover travel or a ticket or a babysitter for anyone who needed a witness in the room when their moment arrived and their family stayed home. And as the door to the studio swung open, I knew that if they wanted a performance, I would give them something better, a blueprint with my name on it and a clock already running. The on-air light woke up with a steady glow, and the host did the quick preface about how a single sentence can split a room, and then he turned to me with the kind of measured curiosity that tells you he has been given permission to let the conversation breathe. So I took a breath and I said that when I looked into the camera and told the people who were too busy to care to stay that way, I was not being theatrical or cruel. I was saying out loud what I had been living for years, which is that some relationships only function if you agree to be the one who apologizes first, who organizes the details, who fills the empty seats with excuses and calls it grace. And that I had reached the point where grace and self-erasure had started to look identical, and I chose not to mistake one for the other anymore. I told him that the inbox that exploded afterward did not fill with gossip or hate. It filled with stories that sounded like mine told by different mouths, and I asked if I could read a few lines that came with permission, and when he nodded I read sentences about graduations watched from parking lots because a parent could not find a seat, about hospital recoveries that turned into selfies for someone else's timeline, about birthdays delayed until a sibling was free, and as I read them the control room quieted in a way you can feel under your skin, which is the sound of something obvious being named without apology. He asked whether I had confronted my family directly before speaking on stage, and I said that I had done the private approach for most of my adult life, and that, just this morning, I sent a plain document to my parents and my siblings and BCC'd the circle that likes to praise our closeness from a safe distance, a document that listed dates and facts and messages without adjectives. And I said that I did not need to call anyone out by name because the pattern is the story, although I also happened to receive a screenshot from a cousin last night that showed a calendar invite titled Family Night scheduled for the precise hour of my event, complete with a note that said everyone except her, smile big, which I would not have believed if it came from anyone else, but there it was in the handwriting I know better than my own, and while I was not here to humiliate anyone, I refused to let anyone tell me I made this up. The host looked at the printout the producer slipped under his hand and he winced in that small way people do when a thing becomes too literal to dodge, and he said that it takes a particular kind of confidence to say stay that way, and then keep moving, and I told him it was not confidence so much as self-respect rediscovered. When he asked what I wanted from all of this, I said I wanted fewer people to sit alone at their own milestones and call it maturity, and then I said I was starting a small but stubborn fund named for the sentence that started this. A pot that would pay for a ticket or a train ride or a babysitter or a single hotel night so that someone who has no family in the room can bring one witness who will clap when their name is called, and that I was seeding it with my entire fee from today's appearance and the next speaking check that clears, and that the link would be on the station page by evening with a simple form that takes minutes, not hours. The host glanced at the producer, then back at me, and said that for the next day he would personally match up to a reasonable cap because he had a daughter and did not want her to learn that milestones are private chores. And while I do not cry easily on camera, I felt that pressure rise and then settle into purpose, because this was the revenge I had wanted without knowing it, not a spectacle but a structure that says what you did to me will build something I wish I had. We wrapped the segment without a bow, and when the light dimmed my phone began jittering across the table with messages that managed to be both frantic and familiar, a thread from my mother that spun the story into a misunderstanding. A paragraph from my sister accusing me of monetizing hurt, a single line from my brother that called me ungrateful, and then the text that made me exhale through my teeth because it was so perfectly on brand. A message from my father that read, "You have gone too far," which is a phrase I have heard in rooms where my needs were an inconvenience and also in rooms where my success threatened to rearrange a family legend, and before I could decide whether to answer, the producer tapped my shoulder and said that the inbox at the station was flooding with notes from people asking how to help, and also with a few messages that looked like damage control from relatives who were suddenly very invested in scheduling a joint interview to clear the air, and I smiled in a way that did not feel cruel so much as final, because I knew exactly what would go out if anyone tried to call me a liar on air, and it was already prepared, already time-stamped, already cued to post with the blandest caption I have ever written, which meant that by the time my father's lawyer decided to introduce himself, the truth would have been public long enough to make denial look like theater, and the question would no longer be whether I had gone too far, but whether they had ever come far enough to meet me halfway. By the time the segment replayed in the evening slot and the station posted the application link for the Witness Fund, the requests were already stacking into neat little rows that felt less like a flood and more like a ledger of what had been missing from so many lives for so long. And while I sat at my kitchen table assigning the first approvals, one for a daughter whose mother refuses to sit in auditoriums, one for a nurse graduating after night shifts, one for a man walking across a small town stage to collect a certificate that took him half his life to earn, I realized that this, more than any apology I could wring from my family, was the thing that would keep me from shrinking myself to fit inside their comfort. Because I was building a scaffold where something solid could stand without asking permission from the people who had proved, again and again, that my milestones were best enjoyed from a safe distance. Predictably, the retraction demand arrived before midnight in the kind of language that pretends to be calm while threatening to swallow you whole. A 3-page letter from my father's lawyer that accused me of defamation without citing a single false line and warned of consequences that sounded serious until you held them up against the timestamps and the calendar invite and the message threads in my archive. And instead of spiraling into the old habit of second-guessing myself, I forwarded the letter to a woman I hired months ago to review contracts for speaking gigs, adding a short note that said, "Please respond with the facts only," and attached the timeline packet labeled winter. After which I turned off my phone and wrote the kind of auto-reply I wish someone had written for me years ago, one that said that any attempt to drag me back into the fog would be answered by daylight, and that while I was not chasing a fight, I was also not moving an inch. In the morning her reply went out with the kind of crisp detachment that makes bullies blink, a single paragraph that cited 3 specific exhibits and repeated, twice, that any further public mischaracterization would trigger the release of the full record with redacted names. And as I read it, I felt the shape of something unfamiliar in my chest, not triumph exactly, more like ownership, the sense that I was no longer a defendant in a trial that only ever convened when I spoke up. The next move was mine, and I made it without spectacle, which is to say I posted the smallest announcement I could think of and let the work carry the weight. 2 rows of seats purchased in my name at the city auditorium for the next month of ceremonies with a quiet plaque that read "Witness seats sponsored by the Stay That Way Fund, reserved for anyone whose family could not be bothered," and a private note to the venue manager with a list of names pulled from the approved applications, and while part of me expected pushback or at least a handful of smug comments about stunts, the only real reaction was gratitude so loud it read like quiet. Ushers writing to say that they had never seen a section fill so fast with people who did not bring entourages, just one steady friend who clapped until their palms hurt. Somewhere between the second and third ceremony, a message arrived from my mother that did not sound like her at all, not because it was kind, but because it was simple, a single line that said, "I watched the show and I did not know about the calendar invite," followed by a second line that said, "I am sorry if you felt alone," which landed like a pebble on a floor that had already been torn up. Because what I needed was not a hypothetical regret but a concrete change, and I told her as much by sending the same document I had sent the family with one addition at the end, a small box titled terms that were not punishments but commitments. 3 appearances in a year without excuses, 1 phone call answered when it rings, 1 event attended in silence without a note about my tone later, and a ledger to mark each act, not to keep score, but to make sure the math could not be massaged into a story where nothing happened. They tried other angles, of course they did. An aunt who wanted a mediated conversation on a podcast, a cousin who offered to broker a truce if I removed the phrase "stay that way" from my profiles. Even a stranger who identified himself as a consultant for family brands and suggested that I might be able to monetize reconciliation if I softened the edges for a broader audience, and I said no to each without flourish. Because the point of a boundary is not that it makes noise, it is that it holds. And while they busied themselves circling the wagons, the fund kept expanding in quiet increments, donors sending small amounts with notes that broke my heart in the cleanest way. Lines like, "I do not have much, but I remember the feeling, and I want to buy someone a chair where they are seen." On the last night of that first month, I stood at the back of the auditorium during a nursing pinning and watched a section of strangers lean toward the stage as if they had known the names on the program their whole lives, and just before the lights dimmed, a volunteer pressed a small envelope into my hand with no return address, inside of which was a printout of an old email from my father to a client bragging about my work as if it belonged to him. An email I had never seen and might have been gutted by in another season, yet tonight it felt like the final confirmation that my family had always known the value of what I was doing. They just preferred the benefits without the obligation to look me in the eye. And while that realization should have stung, it instead settled me, because it meant I was not crazy, I was simply done. I did not make a grand statement or a last speech or a victory lap. I walked onto a small stage at a community center and told a new room what I had learned, which is that revenge that lasts does not scorch, it builds, it takes the material you were given. Indifference, excuses, a calendar invite that turned your absence into a joke, and it constructs a place where other people can bring a witness to watch them rise, and then it invites anyone who wants to be part of the solution to pull up a chair. And when I went home that night, I opened a draft message to my mother that ended not with a dare but with a sentence she would recognize, a sentence that had stopped being a dismissal and started being a perimeter. I wrote that if it is still too busy to care, then stay that way, and if it is finally not, then do not say it, just show up, and I hit send without bracing for impact, because the final move had already been made and it was not mine alone anymore.